Audiobooks might seem like a daunting task to tackle, but you can tackle it, and I'm going to show you how with 5 lessons that I've learned from my own audiobook recording. Hi, I'm Jed Herne, and this is Daily Writing Advice. Today we are talking about audiobooks, specifically about the audiobook for Fires of the Dead, which I recently recorded locked in a closet not far from where I'm recording this at the moment. And it was a really fun process to read out my own writing and just kind of analyze it through the framework of how this sounds as a spoken piece. And there's 5 particularly important things that I learned from this, which are going to help me do it a lot faster next time. So I'm partly making this episode for my future reference, but will also help you do an audiobook easier, quicker, and better if you choose to produce your own in the future. So, tip number 1. Prefer free indirect speech over direct thought. Okay, so what do all those words mean? So free indirect speech is when you don't differentiate in your narration between the narrator saying something and the character thinking something. So for instance, you would say, Bob thought that it seemed really rude of Sally to shut the door in his face. And that would just be in plain narration, no italics, no quotations, nothing like that. That's free indirect speech. That's the narrator indirectly telling the reader what the character is thinking and feeling. Direct thought, on the other hand, is when you have italics typically. It would be, it's so rude of Sally to slam the door in my face, thought Bob. And it's so rude of Sally to slam the door in my face would be in italics, and the thought Bob would just be normal after that. That's direct thought. That's when you are sort of like breaking the boundaries between the narration and almost having the character turn aside to the reader and give them a soliloquy, almost like a little bit of an aside, and then you're back into the story. And both forms of conveying thought can come across in audiobooks, but one thing that I found sort of surprising was that free indirect speech is so much easier to convey because you literally don't have to change the way you're narrating. You're just saying, Bob did this, Bob did that, Bob thought that it was really rude that blah, 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 blah. As opposed to the weird italics thing where you somehow have to, I don't even know how I did it. I think I'd just randomly looked off into the distance and tried to think that I was having that voice in the head moment that you see in movies or whatever, where you're just like, oh, Bob thought that this was why such and such happened. And it just didn't come across great. And I actually picked this up in earlier editing passes of the book. I tried to strip out a lot of this kind of italicized thought and substituted it for free indirect speech instead, because I had heard that it was a bit easier to narrate, and also it just felt more right for some of the passages. But definitely for future books, I'm going to think quite carefully about whenever I want to have that italicized thought, because it's a technique I'd never really questioned much before, but having had to actually narrate that, I realize now that it sort of doesn't flow as well as the free indirect speech. And what's beneficial about the free indirect speech is that it's more subtle in how it's conveyed. And it means that readers can kind of imagine that the whole narration of your book is being processed through the framework of your character. Whereas with italics, you're sort of implying that, 99% of the book is just this weird narrator saying things. Oh, and then look, we're going to just zoom the camera into the character's head for a bit, and then we're back out and you don't see what they're thinking at this stage. If that's the case, it sort of makes you question like, is this narration coming from the character? Is it coming from someone else? Whereas when you have the free indirect speech, it means that it's just all coming from that narrator. It's all coming from that character, and that the character and the narrator are the same. So, that was tip number 1. Tip number 2 is very similar. Avoid tricky punctuation or formatting. So, this wasn't so much of an issue with Fires of the Dead, but I think about some other things I've written, and I realize now that they would be a pain in the butt to narrate, because some of them have weird forms of punctuation and formatting. And if you think about an audio medium, that stuff doesn't really come across amazingly well. If you have weird things like, let's say, a slash in there, and the phrase is like and/or, it just feels a bit weird, right? Like you read that and it's really easy to see what's coming across. But when you're listening to a narration of that, it's sort of, at least for me, maybe it's different for you, it sort of pulls me out of it a bit. And that's probably a bad example. There's probably some more forms of punctuation which are more shouting in your face and weird to format. But this is something worthwhile considering. Do you really need that fancy formatting? Do you really need that sort of weird punctuation thing that you've got going on there? That was ironic that I was talking about weird punctuation and then I said got like 3 times in a row. But point being, do you really need those kind of weird gimmicks? Or can you simplify it so that there's more focus on what matters? Your story. Tip number 3, take regular breaks because you will need them. You wouldn't think that talking into a microphone for a couple of hours would be super straining, but it actually is. This kind of talking that I'm doing right now, because it's just completely off the cuff and I don't really have a script that I'm reading out, I just have sort of bullet point notes. This stuff I could do all day because it's just using my natural voice. But when you start reading, I don't know what it is, but it just feels very different and it's a strain on your vocal cords. So I found that it was really important for me to take a break at the end of every chapter. And I was lucky in the sense that I intentionally want the chapters in this book to be really fast to create that kind of quick pacing. So each chapter only probably took maybe anywhere between 10 to 20 minutes to record. And that was so valuable because it meant that my voice stayed fresh. It meant that I didn't get to a stage where my voice was like destroyed, and it meant that I didn't get to a stage where I was really tired and talking in a monotone voice like this, because that would be really boring for the listeners. So take regular breaks more than you think you'll need and schedule plenty of time to do this process. I recorded my 24,000 word novella over the course of 2.5 days. On any given day, I probably did no more than an hour and a half of solid recording at one time, but that's sort of probably the upper limit of where I would feel comfortable recording, because anything more than, for me at least, 12,000 words a day was just not achievable. So even though you might do a little test and you might realize, in an hour I can easily narrate 7,000 words, which is pretty much the rate I was at, I think, that's probably not going to translate across to 100,000 word book if you are choosing to narrate that whole thing. Number 4, voices. Voices and accents for different characters are really hard to narrate, at least for me, because I felt really self-conscious doing it. So what I've decided to do for next time, and what I kind of realized a bit through this process, was that it's really important to nail those down early on in the process and to actually like have some notes for how you want these people to sound. In particular, when you're writing different characters, it's so important to make sure that they actually sound different, even if you are reading them out in the same accent, because you might be able to distinguish it between them really easily because you obviously are super familiar with it. But if the listener is not very familiar with it and your accents aren't very good in terms of you actually speaking to narrate the thing, then it's all down to the actual individual voices of the character in the text, what kind of words they use, the phrases they say, how they structure their sentences. Make sure these are different enough for each of your characters so that regardless of the quality of your narration, it will be abundantly clear who's speaking. One thing in particular that helped me a lot with creating different voices is actually having like a physical cue for it. So when I had my main character, well, not my main character, but the character who starts narrating the book at the beginning, I kind of like imagined myself sort of doing this weird like smiling thing and like stooping forward a bit. And then I pictured like a particular actor. Actually, no, I didn't picture a particular actor. I pictured Bruce Springsteen for some reason, because that was kind of the accent I was going for, like an old version of Bruce Springsteen. And then I did his voice like that. I'm not going to do it now because I realized that would make sense for me to do it now, but I'm on the spot. But if you want to check out the accent, you can check out the audiobook. But basically, I found that having visual cues for each character really helps. So whether that's as simple as like frowning for a character who's always grumpy, or like clenching your hands for a character who's always angry, or like opening your eyes for a character who's always scared, I found it really useful to just have these ways to quickly get myself into the mindset of that character. Because you might be going through a scene with 4 different people in the same room, and you've got to quickly swap back and forth between them all. And then lastly, tip number 5, the most important tip out of any of them I'm going to give you today, and that is this. You can do this. It is possible to record an audiobook by yourself without having to have a massively fancy studio, without having to pay for a really expensive microphone or really expensive voice actors. It is possible to do. It's going to take time and it's going to be really difficult, but it's possible to do. For me, it was as simple as just finding the quietest room in my house, which was just this like little linen closet, putting tons of blankets in there to muffle the sound, and then just using my Blue Snowball microphone, which is the microphone I am recording on right now, which costs under $100. It's reasonably affordable. And then just taking time to learn how to use the audio editing programs. You can do this. This is one part of the process where if you don't have much money, but you do have a lot of time, you're really at an advantage because you can take the time to set aside a week, set aside a couple of days to just sit down, record the audiobook, have plenty of water on hand, have plenty of like sore throat lozenges on hand, and just smash it out. This is something that you can do and it's within your grasp. And that is our episode. So I hope that those tips helped you. I know that they're definitely going to help me if I do any more audiobook recording in the future. It was a really fun experience to record the audiobook for Fires of the Dead, and I hope that you will consider checking it out and maybe seeing if I did an alright job. So, thank you so much for listening. I've been Jed Herne, and this has been Daily Writing Advice. Now go and write, and maybe even read extraordinary stories.